Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Wichita and Kansas government and public affairs. Broadcast on Great Plains Television, that's channel 26.1. Also on my site, The Voice for Liberty at wichitaliberty.org. There you'll find all the past episodes of Wichita Liberty TV, show notes for the episodes, and all the other content that I and others produce on nearly a daily basis. So, last week we started talking about some of the economic development incentives programs in Wichita and Kansas, and we want to continue that along today. So with me here we've got Carl Peterjohn, our co-host there. And Carl, last week we talked a little bit about these incentives or things we give, a variety of things we give to companies intended to recruit them to our area, maybe retain them from leaving, or help them to expand. And we need that, well, I don't know if we need the incentives, but we certainly need to expand the Wichita economy. We also presented evidence last week that the Wichita economy is in the doldrums, if anything, and people are suffering because of that.
Well, we're lagging the national averages, unfortunately.
And on almost any measure.
Yeah, in terms of employment, in terms of unemployment numbers, our unemployment figure is higher than the statewide average, and while we've been able to have some numbers where we don't compare too badly nationally, we're falling behind, and I think it's going to have some long-term consequences in terms of population, job growth, income growth, and just the general overall quality of life.
Yeah. So the politicians and bureaucrats, they tell us without incentives we can't compete with other areas, or companies will leave Wichita to go to other places that give incentives, or companies not able to expand here without incentives. And we saw industrial revenue bonds last week whose purpose is not to loan the companies money, but to convey tax breaks to them. Property tax and sales tax are what those go for. So this week, we mentioned, I think, a little bit last week, that why do we do this? Well, the city and other agencies use a benefit cost ratio, where the idea is that if the city were to spend money on incentives or to give up future tax revenue due to incentives, they're still going to get much more tax revenue back again, that being the benefit and the cost and the ratio there. Wichita does have a policy that this ratio must be 1.3 to 1 or better, but there's a lot of loopholes.
The county had that too.
Because they do have, I think, a joint policy, the city and the county, or at least a common policy.
Well, Wichita and Sedgwick County do.
Yeah. These numbers are prepared by the Center for Economic Development and Business Research at Wichita State University using input data from the applicant company. Now, it's based upon multipliers, which is the concept that when someone spends money, a company spends money, then that money just doesn't evaporate. It gets spent again and spent again. Some of it will be spent locally, some will be spent out of town, some will be sent to China, wherever. These multipliers are an attempt to estimate what is the effect of that extra spending as it flows through the local economy. And the multiplier values themselves come from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. That's part of the U.S. Chamber, or Department of Commerce. Again, calculated by Wichita State University based upon a firm data sheet. And so, Carl, here's one of the questions. What are the new or additional sales of the firm related to this project year 1 through year 10? So for each year, the company is supposed to estimate how much new sales are, but it gets worse than that. What percent of these sales are subject to sales taxes in the city, the county, or the state?
Well, it gets tricky because under state law here in Kansas, the county has a countywide sales tax. Now, the city of Derby does have a municipal sales tax, but almost all the other municipalities in Sedgwick County, I think there might be 1 or 2 others, rely strictly on the countywide 1-cent sales tax. But the county only gets to spend 27 cents out of every dollar that they collect. The rest goes to the municipalities, with Wichita, of course, getting the largest share.
And I think they do try to incorporate for that there. But the idea is that yeah, in year 6 we think sales are going to be this much, and in year 8 this much. And it's even more, there's a whole other pages of questions they have to answer too. How many new employees? How many visitors to Wichita in years 1 through 10 do you think this project will induce? And what percent of those come from out of the state versus some other county? I mean, it's just on and on like that. I think when
You can get widely different results depending upon what input you provide.
Yeah, because he's going to a
And
mathematical formula.
If you're not careful, you get what the highly technical term that computer experts called garbage in, garbage out.
Well, it's not only not being careful, it's just that these things are subjects to high levels of uncertainty.
Exactly.
I mean, if we could plan out businesses like that in the future, then no one has to take any risk about anything. There's nothing called entrepreneurship anymore. And
we could all have our 5-year plan and proceed accordingly like they did in the old Soviet Union.
yeah, that was Stalin every year. You know, they rolled out a new 5-year plan. So, you know, when I presented this at the Pachyderm Club, I put up a slide that said, economists use a decimal point now and then to remind us they have a sense of humor, which is kind of goes along here. So, Carl, we're at our first break time here. So let's take a moment for a commercial break. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. Bob Weeks with Carl Peterjohn here, talking about economic development incentives and their implications. So these multipliers recognize that, you know, money and goods and services flow through the economy. That happens, no doubt about it, but it happens for everything, whether it's economic activity that received economic development incentives or not. So the question is the incentive necessary? That's always the question we have to ask, because think about all the economic activity that happens without incentives here.
Well, that's why the but for was the magic phrase that I'd hear whenever the subject of TIF districts would come up. Bob, I think it's important for the viewers out there to understand we're primarily talking about city incentives, because even though the county certainly has a say in TIF districts, and theoretically the school districts could too. We could go into why they don't, but the county really didn't have an involvement when you got into the other areas, except for industrial revenue bonds. The county did issue IRBs and TIF districts, but everything else, the CIDs,
the city is
strictly
definitely the driver
a city function, and the city initiates the TIF districts. The county, well, we'd get a notification saying you've got so many days to take action if you want to, in effect, a veto over the TIF district. But other than that, you know, it would automatically go into place in effect.
And we'll see that in just a couple moments there. But on the benefit cost ratio, what are the benefits that go into this calculation? Were there taxes that are paid to government, city, state, county, and all like that? Not necessarily a benefit to the general public, it's a benefit to government.
Well, but the idea is that government provides services, and if they've got more revenue, they can provide more services.
Don't
the problem
make me
that
laugh,
comes,
Carl.
The,
I mean, who
problem-
really believes that it's best to
Well-
have government provides these services for us?
well, the people would say, okay, wait a minute, we've got basic, we've got public safety, we've got the courts, we've got roads, we've got, in this case of the county, we've had a strong structure of social service areas, whether it was for ComCare, for people who are struggling with a variety of problems, or seniors, for instance. So there are services that are provided. The big problem that you run into is how you come up with a value and how you allocate within that, because, for instance, senior centers, there are a variety all throughout the county. Every municipality has at least one. Some Wichita has more than, it's structured differently by each city. But the focus would be on how do you come up with a sensible way of determining what value there is. And since this is the only metric they have, it's what gets measured, Bob.
Well, I think it'd be best if the government did less and let people provide more services through voluntary action. But that just shows another disincentive here. if you're a government bureaucrat or politician, the more jobs a project creates, the better it is for you. I mean, do you want 500 jobs or 800 jobs? Which is better for the politician? But businesses, on the other hand, jobs are a cost to be minimized. So politicians, I mean, they're not paying for the employees' paychecks, so they want more jobs. But businesses, if they're honest, they need to know that employment costs are to be minimized as much as possible.
But you've got other factors in the equation in terms of not only the number of jobs, but how much they pay. And that's critical because obviously for most communities, they'd like higher paying jobs. The county and Wichita were in some discussions. There was talking about bringing Tyson Foods with the chicken processing. And
plant.
ironically enough, I discovered later that Kansas, despite all our agriculture, has almost no chicken industry. Now, if you go to Arkansas, Missouri, Oklahoma, there's a great deal compared to Kansas, but we have almost none. And if that project had taken off, it would have occurred, but the jobs that we were talking about, a lot of them were basically
they weren't executive level jobs.
Well, they were not high income jobs. They would be basically chicken processing type of
chicken plucking
and related to transportation or warehousing or those types of functions.
But we need those types of jobs too. And a lot of these incentive programs, especially at the state level, they are tied or limited to jobs that pay higher than the average wage for an area or something like that. Tyson jobs would not have qualified, but Spirit Aerosystems jobs do, for example.
Well, tech jobs generally easily qualify, and they're sexier in the sense that they don't have concerns about, like in the case of Tyson, there were questions about
water
pollution, and sewage, and
feathers
all
flying
that.
all over, and smell, and so forth. And
those are all factors, and if you don't watch it, you can bite yourself. You can cause a lot of harm to your own community, because there are projects that I know of. One case where they were looking at an overnight air freight service and basically said, well, we don't want planes flying in at 3 o'clock in the morning because it's going to disturb people's sleep. And so the company and the jobs went elsewhere. And they didn't come to Kansas.
Okay. Carl, we're at halftime here, so we're going to take another moment for a commercial break, and we'll be right back. Welcome back again to Wichita Liberty TV. Bob Weeks with Carl Peterjohn here, talking about economic development incentives. So they use this cost-benefit ratio as a justification, saying, yeah, it's going to cost us cash now, taxes in the future, but we're going to get so much more from that. And we saw that the firm data sheet is just an impossible amount of data we ask these companies to give, highly speculative. And I should say that if someone was...
Subjective. I would use the word subjective, not speculative.
Well, both,
but,
I think.
Well, when you say speculate, I mean, it implies that you're putting your own money at risk in a sense.
Okay, that's true there.
And subjective is you can't get a firm handle on it, which that's part of
but yet
risk
the
and
formula is
uncertainty.
required, that firm number.
The formula, but it's a hidden formula. And all the folks at Wichita State will say about it is, and I tried to get my hands to understand more of the mechanisms, and I think it's basically probably a fairly straightforward input-output, because if you change the variables in the input side, you can kind of see how the results move around. And so even though you can't see the exact mechanism, it falls within kind of the Keynesian macroeconomic model of aggregates and aggregations. And I think it loses a lot of the importance that the role of the individual and microeconomic approach as opposed to a aggregate macro.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's true. But there's an issue with accountability, Carl, because the city of Wichita says WSU provides the numbers for us, but WSU says we use the data the company provides us. And there's a lot of finger pointing there, and if something doesn't work out, the city says, oh, well, that's what WSU told us, and WSU says, oh, well, that's what the company told us. And there's really
And the buck passes here.
yeah, very little accountability there. So that's, I think, a problem with a lot of this. So, Carl, the second major program we need to talk about is tax increment financing, or TIF. That's a pretty big thing in Wichita.
What I call a TIF subsidy district.
Yeah, you're
because
right.
a lot of people, and when these came up before the county commission, I think the word subsidy, because it's inherently confusing. You say tax increment financing, well,
Yeah.
the tax is incrementally.
Although that's
what?
a pretty good description, but it's not complete. You need to know a little bit more about that. And if I were to say, my nickname for this program is, for IRBs it was, I'm not going to pay any tax. For tax increment financing is, I'm paying property taxes to myself, because that's basically what happens. Future increases in property taxes are rerouted back to benefit the development in some way. Development outside a TIF district, where does the things go? Well, I think we've got a slide on the screen there that shows a vacant lot or an empty building, a dilapidated building or whatever. It still pays some taxes, but because it's dilapidated, it's probably a pretty
Not a
low
lot of
level of
value,
tax.
not a high valuation.
But it does pay taxes to the city, the county, the school district, the state, the cemetery district.
Right,
the
these special
there could be a
districts.
lot of districts, but those are the big ones there. So what happens when we form a TIF district is we take a day before the district is formed, we look at how much taxes are being paid at that time, and that's called the base. Now, the next slide shows us that after a couple years, or whatever it takes to develop the project, we have a developed project. There's still that base level of taxes that goes to city, school, county, and so forth like that. But pretty soon the appraiser drives by and says, wow, that's a nice, shiny, new, renovated office building. I'm going to slap a bigger tax bill on him. So that extra new tax that they have to pay is called the incremental tax. And where does that incremental tax go? Well, it goes to pay off, usually it goes to pay off bonds, TIF bonds, that the city or county issued at the time of the formation of the district. It's actually the redevelopment plan, but that's a technicality. And that money had been used to benefit the district. It was used to pay for demolition or site a lot of different things it could be used for. So the extra tax that people are paying is really going back to pay off bonds that were used to benefit the district.
Well, it's supposed to stay within the district as the increment for a period of time. And then when it's over and done with, then it would go to the general fund and
But
benefit the whole community
It's like
at that
20
point.
years, Carl, a TIF district.
Right.
I mean, that's a long time away. If we're
Unfortunately-
still here in 20 years, I mean, we're doing well. So talk about speculative there. Who knows what's going to happen in that long period of time.
Well, who's
But-
what's going to happen in 2 or 3 years, let alone 20?
Exactly, yeah. So that's why I call it paying taxes to yourself. Yes, the developers do pay the full tax load as if they were not in a tax increment financing district, but it's going back to themselves.
And it's a challenge for the local governmental units to monitor. I struggled trying to get information from the city of Wichita on the TIF districts existing that had been in place for years here in Wichita, because generally they were struggling to meet their projections.
Yeah, and we've got some issues about that coming up soon too, but we're going to have to take our last commercial break for today, and when we come back, we'll continue talking about tax increment financing. Well, welcome back to our last segment of Wichita Liberty TV. For today, Bob Weeks with Carl Peterjohn here, talking about economic development incentives, TIF, or tax increment financing in general. I think the viewers right now are seeing a slide that shows that a TIF district is a geographical area that's formed at a particular time. But the TIF district itself is just a fairly vague description. It is
The city
geographical
council,
boundaries.
under state law that allows TIF districts that's created by the municipality where the TIF district would be located.
But then nothing really happens until there's the passage of one or more redevelopment districts. So these are usually smaller areas within the TIF district. You can see the illustration shows development district A, B, and C. They could be big, they could be small, they could be the whole TIF district too. But these authorize specific spending of money and the issuing of bonds and all the type of things necessary to really get going. And the next slide shows us that these TIF districts can be huge. The Center City South TIF district in downtown Wichita covers, well, I mean, it extends as far north as First Street to as far south as Lewis, and from Main Street on the west all the way to the railroad tracks that are, by Nafsker Park and Old Town there. So that's a good chunk of downtown Wichita. I don't know how many acres, but a lot.
I was going to say, most of downtown Wichita, what people commonly view as downtown Wichita, are in one or more of the TIF subsidy districts and have been for many years.
And then the next slide shows an example of a redevelopment area. Those two maps are not to scale, but the Nafsker Park area, that area plus a little bit further to the south of it was created last year as another redevelopment district within the Center City South District to provide for funds for the Spaghetti Works District, what we now call the Spaghetti Works District.
But complicating this all, Bob, is the city has created an overlay, a special downtown area and a downtown taxing district, the Schmid.
Yeah.
And so it is incredibly confusing for most folks even for folks who are involved in this down at City Hall, but for the average citizen out there, I hope you're able to understand just sort of the outline, because we're touching on a very general overview of a very complicated set of processes, whether
they are, no doubt about it.
When you have all these TIF districts, and they're all over town, although I'd say most of them in terms of size are concentrated downtown here in Wichita.
And it's complicated because, like we said, the developers do pay their full load of property tax. It's just that most of that, the increment, gets rerouted back to them for their benefit.
For the duration of the TIF district.
Yeah. And so that's where you get this but-for criteria. It's really not used anymore, but still politicians use it, especially Janet Miller, former city council member. She says, well, if we don't do the TIF district, nothing's going to happen there and we get nothing. And that's not the case. There have been examples to the contrary. Another thing about TIF district is a lot of the things the TIF money is spent on is infrastructure, and people will say, well, that's the city's job to build infrastructure. But no, you look at, I gave the example of, the waterfront development at 13th and Webb Roads in Wichita on the northeast side, which is just a beautiful development. There's a road called Waterfront Parkway that traces through there from, I don't know, it's about how long it is, but it's a beautiful road, beautiful bridges, lush landscaping and everything. Johnny Stevens and Steve Clark built that and paid for it, and then they deeded it over to the city. But that's the type of expense that is often paid for by tax increment financing if that had been in a TIF district.
Yes, but there are a number of private roads here in Wichita where, for one reason or another, the developer decided to retain control over those roadways so that they could also have control over the property as as time passes, and they may want to change use for that roadway or replace it or change it.
And if you look at, like, on 13th Street and also on Webb Road, there's some new traffic signals that went in. Well, this is quite a while ago now. You may be thinking, okay, traffic signals, that's the city's responsibility. But the answer is no. Those traffic signals were paid for and assessed as special taxes on that private property. But that's the type of thing where if that had been built in a TIF district, the TIF financing would have paid for that. Yes, the developer still paid their property taxes, but it went to pay for those street lights, where non-TIF developers have to pay for those street lights and the property taxes too.
Well, we have an unlevel playing field at this point, and it goes to what economists like to call rent-seeking, or basically what I like to call subsidy seeking.
Exactly. Now, there is another type of TIF district called pay-as-you-go, where we don't borrow money. Instead, we just give the property tax money back to them on an as-you-go basis. And that kind of brings up the question, well, why even tax them in the first place if you're just going to give it back? Well, I think the mayor would say, oh, we're not just going to give people cash, but we are, aren't we?
Well, money is fungible, Bob.
Exactly.
Fungible, just so that people understand.
Maybe we'll put that in the show notes. Well, in the show notes for today's episodes, you will have some links to more information about the topics we've talked today. And Carl, we're out of time for today, but we're still just barely scratching the surface. We've still got a lot of major programs to talk about and what they mean to us here. So please tune in next week, and thank you so much for watching.